Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of Hanging Out for a Living. Today we have the privilege of interviewing Dirk Mulder, an esteemed executive with a wealth of experience in international education and the education service industry overall. He has over 20 years in the field, and Dirk has worked with leading universities, education institutions in Australia, and gaining valuable expertise in student recruitment, international relations, student experience, and health. His impressive track record includes managing large teams and fostering high performance cultures. So join us as we delve into Dirk's insights and learn from his very vast knowledge in this ever evolving higher education industry. So welcome all the way from Australia.
Thanks, Teresa. I almost didn't know who you were introducing there. It sounded too good to be true.
I've known you for many years. We're not going to say how many because that'll age me, not you. And it only speak the truth, as I always say. So what do you say? We dive right in so our listeners can get to know you and, really kind of tap into your expertise. So
Sounds good.
let me ask you this. Can you share some of your experiences working with international students and how you have contributed to their recruitment and mobility within the education sector?
Yeah, sure. I've been really fortunate. I've probably been in international education since 2003. So that's probably dating me now. And I still remember my first ever trip because it was to Canada and to Toronto actually. And if I don't mind telling a little story, I still remember my mum and dad taking me to the airport, and it was the first time ever that an organization or someone else had paid for me to travel. And it was such I guess a daunting experience at that point in time. I felt like I was representing, I had to be on my best behavior, but it was a wonderful experience at the same time. Not long after that, I think I had my second trip, and that was to India. And this is, if you're talking about back in 2003, India probably isn't necessarily the developed place that it is now. And I still remember arriving into Kolkata at about 1 o'clock in the morning, and there were roof tiles missing from the ceiling of the airport, and power leads hanging down, and it was just another experience that I never ever thought I'd get. So I paint that picture to kind of say that's how I kind of started. And along the journey, I guess I've had the privilege of speaking with students, from when they're considering and first considering an education program abroad. And what I mean by that, for American, I guess, audiences, is more about taking a full degree rather than a mobility experience. So doing a full degree abroad, often with their families in tow. So talking with their families and the students up front. Right to the other end of the scale, where I've sat on the stage at graduations and seen the same students that I met prior to them leaving their home country graduating. So it's been wonderful. And that's really probably bookended, the experience. I've had some fantastic experiences, and I've had some really sad experiences as well. So from that point of view, it's been a magical time. In terms of my contribution, I guess my career, has developed from being what we would call a regional marketing manager, and that's somebody who goes out on the road, markets the institution, spends a lot of time face to face with students and their families, counselling them about what the type of experience they might get, the course degree that the university may offer, and all the questions that might come from that. I progressed a little bit, I guess, then up to deputy director and then on to director. And being a director in an Australian university is a little bit different to that of a US university. We kind of cover the whole gamut. So we would have marketing teams and communications team, which specialize in lead generation and engaging with those students at the initial point, through the admissions office, where I think in US institutions that's generally a separate office. We would have international student support, which I think, again, would be a separate office in a US institution, mobility officers, international relations and visits, and of course, compliance. And in Australia, we have a national act that governs, I guess, our ability to maneuver within the international space. So all of those kind of things sit within an international umbrella. So I've been really, really fortunate over that time to, I guess, start very small, but kind of build up to quite a large profile, which has been great.
Absolutely. No, it sounds wonderful. On to the next question then. In your opinion, what are the key factors that contribute to creating a high-performing culture within education service organizations? And how are you successfully how have you successfully implemented these strategies in your previous roles?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a really interesting one, and I think when you look at that term high performing, I think that's really the essence of what we're trying to gather. And I think that may be different across different element or different aspects
Sure.
of a higher education organization. Within an international offering, the three kind of key themes that I look for is really staff and teams understanding the student and their journey. And working within an international context. I mean, at one institution I worked at, we had over 120 different countries represented. So
Wow.
understanding how a student came to you, what their worldview was before arriving, and then being able to, I guess, understand the university and I hate using the word product, but the offering that the university has, and then being able to make that nexus. How do you take somebody on what are really diverse journeys into what is, I guess, a similar journey, but being able to create that nexus to make it as smooth as possible. So in terms of implementing that, it's really, I mean, that goes to the heart of success in international education, really. I think the big one to begin with is staffing. Hiring the right staff is so important. And it's not so much there's a template for this, but it's about really understanding, I guess, where they come from and the empathy that they have for, I guess, that student journey. Many staff come from many different backgrounds that I've worked with in the past, and they've all been very successful. And I guess to that definition, high performing, but they've had very different experiences that they've brought to the table. The second thing that I kind of look for is understanding that not knowing the answer is okay,
Right.
but it's about what you do from there. So, we all work in large, complex organizations that may have many faculty, many staff, many different subject areas. Not knowing the answer to everything is just not possible. But then how do you find out? What's the motivation to find out? What's the motivation to solve the problem? That's really, really important. So I think if you bring those two elements together, that's really good. And then the third thing that melds it all together is having a real student first approach. So if the student is happy, then that's the main outcome. And that's what we aim to do every day.
Wonderful. No, students first, right? Absolutely. And so with the increasing globalization of education, what challenges do you foresee for universities and education providers in attracting and retaining international students? And how can these challenges be effectively addressed?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a complex question, and it
Yeah.
has so many layers to it. To give you some statistics, I guess, to start off with, in 2000, there were about 2 million students studying at tertiary level outside of their home country. Um, in 2020, that was 6.3 million, and that's forecast to grow to 8 million by 2030. So when we talk about that growth and how you say the increase in globalization, there's an increased sort of width of globalization. So where are they actually studying? But there's also an increased depth and popularization of studying abroad as well. Interestingly enough, at the moment, in the 2020 figures,
Mhm.
4.4 million of those students studied in 7 countries. So that's the USA, the UK, Canada, Australia, France, Germany, and Russia.
Ooh.
So when you think about just those 7, that accounts for over well, roughly about 2/3 of all students studying abroad. So it's pretty significant. So with those forecast figures going up to 8 million, obviously there's going to be many more students studying abroad. And I think the first challenge that we might look at is really, I guess, about an institution maintaining its authenticity. So there's lots of pressures at the moment right across the globe on educational institutions, particularly off the back of COVID, where institutions have had to lay off staff, maybe lose subject areas. So this increase in international students, and particularly the revenue that may come with international students, is a real push from central administration and maybe in a US context, an SVP finance or a VP finance kind of role to, hey, let's really make sure that we can, make that extra research contribution, bring back those subject areas and bring back staff. So doing that in an authentic way and making sure that you're true to who you are, the experience that you offer, is really, really important. The second one I think is around scale, and scale takes place in a couple of different ways. So with more students, and I take the state that you're from, New York. I'm not sure how many institutions there are in Rochester, for instance, but there's probably a handful. If each institution increases their international education profile or the international student body by 20%, the scale and the pressure that puts on community services and on other areas also grows as well. In Australia here, we're, I guess, fortunate in that the government allows international students to work off of campus for 20 hours per week or 40 hours per fortnight. So what's the availability of jobs for those increased amount of students as well?
Sure.
So there's a whole bunch of things around scale that I think we probably need to think about. The third is around government policy and national government policy. So visa office policy. One of the things that I think is just broken in the United Kingdom is they're now starting to limit the number of students who have dependents with them. So as numbers grow, what will be national approaches to either supporting or potentially, calming down a little bit those student flows? And again, when you look back to those 7 countries that seem to attract the most students, what's the capacity for that to happen, and what's the government response? The fourth on a global scale, really, and this is just quickly, is probably around human resource attraction. So, many countries, particularly Canada and Australia at the moment, have very open international education programs, and haven't really shied away from the point that we're about attracting human capital and we're about attracting human labour. So when we talk about that, and we talk about that increase to 8 million going around the world, what does that cause at the other end? And will we see brain drains moving out of different countries in Asia? We've seen that probably in the 10 to 15 years out of India, but we've seen some of that return more highly educated. So the thing to watch about that, and again, it's got to do with that scaling, is what are those human labour flows going to be stemming from education?
Absolutely. You never think about the impact on the country. So you think about going and studying, but then there's so much more to it, right? It's so multifaceted. So thank you for sharing that. And student experience, we talked a little bit about that, and health are crucial aspects of international education. How have you approached these areas in your previous roles, and what initiatives or programs have you implemented to enhance the overall well-being and satisfaction of students?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the way that, if I can say I learnt this, if I can put it that way, and I think it's a very Australian approach, is that what we call the student journey. And the student journey starts at the first touch point. So what are the expectations that you're building in that student? What are the images they're seeing? Is this going to be, all candy bars and chocolate for the next 3 years? Or is there going to be, some hard work associated as well? So from my point of view, I very much believe that the first touch of a student sets the parameters and the expectations of what that experience will look like. It's not just an on-campus experience, it's what you build prior. If we fast forward through, I guess, and certainly in Australia, we have what we would call a first touch. We would have, an applications process, an offer process, an acceptance process, and then an arrival. So from a student point of view, we would start that process before arrival. So we would call that a pre-departure kind of initiative. And again, it's about really setting those expectations, particularly the expectations of what will happen in the first month. There's a lot of research out that talks about international student success is born really in that first month of that student being on campus. So from that, what is the arrival experience and the first experience? And the city that I come from here in Perth, we're not the biggest city. I think there's about 2 million people here. And we just happen to be located in a point where a lot of the flights that come from Asia actually arrive at midnight or thereafter. So when a student walks off that plane and it's midnight and they're a little bit tired, what are they expecting and how do we respond to that? And sometimes Perth isn't the busiest airport either. So if you're coming from a Beijing or a Chennai or a Mumbai and you arrive in Perth and there's 2 flights that have arrived, you're not getting that hustle bustle kind of Asian experience that you would expect. So when we might go to an Asian city and it be very busy, and that's culture shock for us, the reverse happens the other way. And I think that's something that we need to be really, really kind of attuned to. Obviously, once they get out of the airport and into accommodation, whether that be on campus or off campus, orientation is probably really the next point. And so orientation's a really big one. I've always been a massive proponent of a social orientation. I think being pro-social early on is really important, and it really underpins social connection. So once, and I think we all know that when we travel and when we're uncomfortable when we travel, if you've got someone to share that experience with, it just lessens that anxiety a little bit. So from my perspective, I've always been really keen on making sure that, it might be an egg and spoon race, something silly to make sure that people are interacting. And once social groups are formed, then we have formal clubs and societies, et cetera, et cetera. But that social underpinning is really important. In terms of health, look, country by country, that's going to be very different. And, the US has a very different health system to what we do in Australia. We probably have a bit more of a socialized health system. Students plug into that via an insurance product called OSHC in Australia, and it's compulsory as part of the international education visa. So they're fully covered from a health perspective, and hospitals, you name it, fully covered. And sorry, I've got to be careful because I have worked for an insurer. They don't have optical or some other things, but from a baseline health cover, they're absolutely covered. The one I want to mention though is mental health, because from an administrator point of view, it's really difficult, I think, to be able to manage mental health of international students. All campuses have counsellors, psychologists, but a lot of the dealings that they have with students are because the student, puts their hand up and actually avails themselves of that service. And then those records are very confidential. So as administrators, we can't actually access those. So to actually be able to help a student with a mental health issue can be really, really difficult, but it's really important as well. So it's one area that we want to really keep an eye on.
Absolutely. When you were mentioning about these students coming off the plane at midnight, the first thing that came to my mind was they're dealing with that, and they must also be dealing with time differences, some of which are pretty significant.
Yeah, absolutely, depending on where they come from. And certainly, I mean, we had students, we had a large mobility presence from the US who would come here for a semester as part of a study abroad program. And yeah, they'd be flying via Sydney and then onwards again. So, go from door to door, they could be looking at 24 hours plus.
Yikes. So we'll wrap up our time together with this last question. And as an executive with extensive international experience, what advice would you give to emerging professionals who aspire to work in the education industry, particularly in roles related to like international relations and student recruitment?
Yeah, look, this is a really difficult one because I don't think international education is a funny sector in that there's no set career progression. If you want to be an accountant, you go into an accounting degree. You want to be a doctor, you go into a medical degree. To be a professional in international education, you can come to it from many, many different angles, and a lot of people just happen to drop into it. I think as time progresses, there are more and more degree type fields that you can avail yourself of to focus on in national education administration. But I guess if you're interested in that area, obviously, if you're interested in the more business and international marketing side of things, there's obviously degrees in international marketing. There's degrees in international relations. There's degrees in corporate governance if you're more into compliance. So I think you've got to try and figure out where you fit in the spectrum and what's your track. Once you figure that out and you've done probably an undergraduate degree in that, try and get a spot within an international program. And my view would be, it doesn't matter what it is, try and get into an international program. Once you're in there, I think the biggest advice that I can suggest is just say yes to everything. And I know that sounds very, very basic, but when I was a regional manager and as deputy director, you might get approached to speak at a little forum of people, of professionals. Don't ever say no to those things, because that's where you get noticed. That's where people will say, hey, this person might actually know what they're talking about. Just say yes to everything. Put your hand up for that trip. Put your hand up to pick that person up from the airport. Put your hand up to do whatever it might be, to represent the faculty, to represent the office. And then you'll soon understand a broader, beyond your, as I mentioned earlier, when we were talking about skill sets, you soon stretch your own skill set. So you've got offerings and tentacles in other areas, and you can soon then move around that program. And once you get across a couple of areas, then you're ready for management, and you can probably start thinking about how you move up the tree as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dirk, for sharing your valuable insights and expertise with us today. Your vast knowledge in the international education and education service industries overall has really shed a light on all the important aspects, or most of the important aspects, such as student recruitment, international relations, student experience in health, and your guidance and advice will undoubtedly be beneficial that you shared here to those aspiring to make their mark in this rather dynamic field. We really appreciate your time and wish you continued success. And to continue the conversation with Dirk, his contact information will be in the description. And thank you again, Dirk, and to everybody out there, thank you for joining us, and make it a great day. Until next time, bye-bye.
Thanks, Tracy. It's been a pleasure.